Today, we're going to deconstruct the violence that defined the 1890s South. And believe me, what the historical sources reveal is far more complex and chilling than you might think.
Blood for blood. Just think about that. This wasn't presented as a crime report, it was a headline celebrating a lynching. The mob were the avengers. This really gets to the core question the sources we're looking at today are asking.
You know, on the surface, it looks like just pure uncontrolled fury. But what if it wasn't random at all? The research strongly suggests that behind this horrific violence, there was a script, a meticulously organized ritual designed to send a very, very powerful message.
106. That's the number of black men lynched in Georgia's Cotton Belt in just one decade, from 1890 to 1899. A truly staggering figure that points to something changing, and fast. And you can see it right here. This was a terrifying escalation in what historians called the reckless decade. The number of lynchings in this one area of Georgia more than doubled. So what on earth was going on? To understand why, we have to look at the fear that was fueling all of this.
So according to the source material, this explosion of violence was a reaction. It came from a white, middle-class male population that felt like their entire world and, crucially, their place at the very top of it was collapsing around them.
And this deep anxiety really came from three big things. First, the Southern economy was an absolute wreck after the war. Second, black men were now citizens with the right to vote and hold office. And third, gender roles were shifting in a fundamental way as women started organizing and having a voice in public life.
This quote from a really prominent Southern editor just captures that feeling of total economic devastation perfectly. He's describing a Southern man being buried in a coffin with nails, even wearing clothes. They were all humiliatingly imported from the North. The feeling was that the South had lost everything, right down to its dignity in death. Now this was the ideal for Southern women before the war, to be dependent, delicate, subordinate. But that ideal was being seriously challenged. The war had forced many women into new roles, and they started seeking education and organizing for their own causes. This was a threat to another pillar of that old social order.
Okay, so you've got all this fear, all this anxiety bubbling up. But how does that get channeled into such specific, targeted violence? Well, the research points directly at the most powerful tool for shaping public opinion at the time, the newspaper.
You have to remember the groundwork for this was laid over centuries. Slavery created what scholars call social death. It's this idea that a group of people can be systematically stripped of their humanity until they're seen more as property than as people. And when that happens, violence against them becomes culturally acceptable. And the newspapers of the day were actively reinforcing this. Just look at the language they used. It's not subtle, is it? White lynch mobs were framed as these noble avengers or indignant citizens who were just restoring order. Meanwhile, their black victims were consistently described with these dehumanizing terms, turning them from men into monsters.
This all builds to the creation of a very powerful and very toxic myth, the black rapist. This narrative was repeated over and over again in papers across the country. It portrayed black men as this inherent sexual threat to the purity of white women, and it provided the ultimate emotionally charged justification for mob violence.
And this is where that narrative leads, directly to the violence itself. Because the sources are really clear on this. These lynchings were not just murders. They were highly organized public rituals. They were performances designed to enforce that social hierarchy.
It's chilling, really, how predictable it became. The sources lay out this four-step script that just played out time and time again. It starts with an accusation, then a mob hunt, then the public execution becomes a spectacle. And finally, mementos, like signs and photographs, are created to turn this horrific act of violence into a public performance of dominance.
I mean, if you need any more proof that this was a ritual, look at this. The newspaper reports at the time make a point of saying that these two men, accused of the same crime a year apart, were executed from the very same tree and limb. The place itself became part of the horrifying tradition.
And as the historian Amy Wood explains, even the photographs from these events followed a script. The white mob would often pose to look calm and orderly, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't a murder, but a necessary act of social control, almost like hunters posing with their prey.
But, and this is so important, this campaign of terror did not go unchallenged. A powerful counter-movement rose up, and they fought back with incredible bravery and really smart strategies.
Leaders like Walter White of the NAACP and the absolutely brilliant educator Mary McLeod Bethune led a struggle that lasted for decades. They used political lobbying, legal challenges, and some really clever acts of civil disobedience, like this protest, where they wore ropes and carried signs that were precisely 11 inches wide, just under the legal limit for what was considered a parade in Washington, D.C.
So you see, their strategy was brilliant, really. They were fighting on two fronts. You had the NAACP pushing hard for political action, changing the laws and holding people accountable. And at the same time, you had leaders like Bethune who had this deep belief in the power of education to change hearts and minds and ultimately dismantle the ideologies of hate. So we come back to that central question. The sources we've looked at today offer a pretty sobering answer. They show us how the fear of losing status can be twisted and weaponized into a ritual of public violence with absolutely devastating consequences, leaving a legacy that people are still fighting to overcome to this very day.